I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of St. Mary Mead was, for the most part, a place where the passage of time was measured by the blooming of primroses and the steady rotation of the vicarage tea service. However, the arrival of Colonel Sebastian Gore at the sprawling, slightly overgrown estate of Wisteria Lodge had introduced a new, rather jarring rhythm to the local geography. The colonel was a man of iron-grey hair and even more metallic temperament, who believed that a garden was not a place for flowers, but a strategic perimeter to be defended. On the afternoon of the village's eagerly anticipated midsummer harvest bazaar, the colonel had done something unprecedented. He had opened his private grounds to the public, albeit under the strictest supervision. The highlight of the tour was the sunken rose garden, a masterpiece of horticultural engineering enclosed by a high stone wall and accessible only through a singular, formidable wrought-iron gate. Miss Jane Marple sat on a nearby stone bench, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the distant drone of a lawnmower. She was ostensibly watching the village children race toward the lemonade stand, but her pale blue eyes were, as usual, cataloguing the movements of the adults. "He looks quite agitated, doesn't he?" murmured Dolly Bantry, settling beside her friend with a tray of scones. "The colonel, I mean. He's been checking that gate every 5 minutes as if he expects an invading army. It is a very beautiful gate, Dolly," Miss Marple replied gently, "though it does remind me a little of the one old Mr. Henderson had at the drapery shop. He insisted on 3 different deadbolts, you remember? He said it was to keep out the burglars, but we all knew it was really to keep his daughter, Margaret, from slipping out to see that young man from the garage. Whenever people build high walls, it is usually because they are afraid of what is already inside." The crowd moved toward the sunken garden for the colonel's scheduled address. Among them were Arthur Melford, the colonel's nervous young nephew and heir, Diana Vance, a local widow with a penchant for expensive hats and a surprisingly deep knowledge of the colonel's financial affairs, and Julian Thorne, a local solicitor who had spent the better part of the morning looking at his pocket watch. The colonel led the group to the gate, produced a heavy brass key from his waistcoat, and turned the lock with a satisfying clack. He stepped inside the enclosure alone, promising to reappear in a moment to lead the guests into the inner sanctuary. The heavy gate swung shut behind him, the latch clicking firmly into place. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A bird chirped in the silence. The villagers began to murmur. Arthur Melford stepped forward, tapping tentatively on the iron bars. "Uncle, the guests are waiting." There was no answer. Julian Thorne peered through the scrollwork of the gate. "I say, Colonel, this isn't the time for a joke." It was Diana Vance who finally screamed. She had caught sight of the colonel's polished boot, protruding from behind a large ornamental sundial at the center of the garden. Through the bars of the locked gate, the villagers watched in horror as the realization dawned. The colonel was lying face down on the manicured turf. Arthur Melford grabbed the bars, shaking them frantically. "The key! Where is the key?" Miss Marple stood up, her knitting needles still. She moved to the gate, her gaze not on the body, but on the lock. The brass key was still inside the lock, but it was on the inside of the garden. The colonel was dead in a perfectly enclosed space, the only entrance locked from the inside, and the only key held by a man who would never speak again. "How very peculiar," Miss Marple whispered, her eyes catching the glint of a single stray thread of bright red silk caught on one of the gate's sharp iron finials. "It reminds me exactly of the time the churchwarden lost his glasses in the bell tower." Everyone looked at the floor, but no one thought to look at the rope. The sun had barely begun to set over the gables of St. Mary Mead before the impossible death of Colonel Sebastian Gore became the sole topic of conversation, from the Blue Boar to the vicarage pantry. The tragedy possessed all the ingredients for a local legend: a wealthy, unpopular victim, a locked gate, and a key that remained tauntingly out of reach on the wrong side of the bars. By early evening, the village was a hotbed of competing theories, each more imaginative than the last. At the post office the next morning, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and feverish speculation. Miss Weatherby was already convinced that the Colonel had been struck down by a mysterious Eastern poison that could be delivered via a trained bee, while Mrs. Hartnell insisted that he had simply been overwhelmed by his own ill temper, which she likened to an overpressurized steam boiler. Miss Marple sat in her neat drawing-room, the afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains, as she poured tea for Dolly Bantry. Dolly was in a state of high excitement, her hat slightly askew, as she recounted the latest developments from the police station. Inspector Slack had arrived within the hour, accompanied by a bewildered young constable, and had spent the evening pacing the perimeter of the sunken rose garden. Police, Dolly said, were completely baffled by the mechanics of the crime. The wall was 10 feet high and topped with jagged glass, the earth was undisturbed, and the only exit was a gate that had been locked from the inside. "It's a miracle of the most sinister kind, Jane," Dolly declared, reaching for a digestive biscuit. "Slack is going grey over it. He's had the lock dismantled, and there isn't a thing wrong with it. No hidden wires, no trick springs. The Colonel went in, the gate closed, and he died. It's as if the air itself turned lethal. And poor Arthur Melford is in a dreadful state. He's the heir, of course, which the police find very interesting, but the boy was standing right next to us when the Colonel fell. He couldn't have been in 2 places at once, unless he's a ghost." Miss Marple continued her knitting, the needles clicking a steady, thoughtful rhythm. "It is very seldom a miracle, Dolly, and almost always a matter of very human planning. It reminds me of the time the old clockmaker, Mr. Wright, found his shop door locked from the inside when he returned from lunch. Everyone thought a thief was hiding in the rafters, but it turned out he had simply trained his terrier to jump against the latch when he whistled through the letterbox. We often look for the complicated explanation because the simple one is too mundane to satisfy our curiosity. People are like clocks. They have a very predictable set of gears, even if the face they show the world is quite ornate. But the key, Jane, the key was in the lock, on the inside, Dolly protested. Exactly, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes distant. It stayed where it was put. That is the most interesting thing. If you want to keep someone out, you lock the door. If you want to make it look as though no one could have entered, you make sure the key remains in the lock. It's a very specific kind of stage management. I couldn't help but notice how Julian Thorne was looking at his pocket watch just before the Colonel entered the garden. He seemed to be timing something, not the Colonel's speech, but perhaps the interval between 2 events. It's a very solicitor-like habit, I suppose, but it puts me in mind of the station master waiting for the 4:15. If the train is late, the entire schedule is ruined. The village gossip had also turned its sharp lens toward Diana Vance. The widow had been seen in heated conversation with the Colonel only days prior, and it was whispered that her late husband's estate had been entangled in one of the Colonel's less successful overseas ventures. The motive of financial ruin was a powerful one in St. Mary Mead, where appearances were maintained at any cost. Some suggested she had used her feminine charms to distract the Colonel while an accomplice scaled the wall, though how anyone could scale 10 feet of glass-topped stone without leaving a mark was a detail the gossips conveniently ignored. Miss Marple listened to these ripples of rumour with a patient, discerning ear. She knew the village would eventually settle on the most dramatic culprit, regardless of the facts. They saw a locked-room mystery. She saw a house where the residents were all hiding something behind their Sunday best. She thought of the red silk thread she had seen on the gate, and the way the Colonel had clutched his chest before falling. It was a pattern she had seen before, a long time ago, involving a very different kind of gate and a very different kind of secret. The village was reacting to the spectacle, but Miss Marple was already looking at the mechanics of the trap. "The trouble with a locked door," she said softly to the empty room after Dolly had left, "is that it tells you exactly where the murderer wasn't. And in my experience, that is usually the first place one should start looking." By the following morning, Inspector Slack had transformed the pristine gravel drive of Wisteria Lodge into a staging ground for a frustration that was rapidly reaching its boiling point. He had spent the early hours attempting to prove that a human being of average height and weight could scale the 10-foot perimeter wall of the sunken rose garden. He had even gone so far as to order a young, athletic constable to attempt the climb with the aid of a ladder, only to find that the jagged glass embedded in the coping stones made any unauthorized entry a bloody and conspicuous impossibility. There were no footprints in the soft, damp earth surrounding the sundial, no indentations from a ladder, and certainly no sign that the heavy wrought-iron gate had been tampered with. To Slack, the situation was a personal insult to his belief in the tangible. People did not simply evaporate through iron bars, and keys did not turn themselves in locks while the owner was 10 yards away. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had arrived at the lodge under the polite pretext of delivering a fresh jar of damson jam to the housekeeper, Mrs. Emmett. She sat in the kitchen, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, comforting click that seemed to encourage the sharing of confidences. Mrs. Emmett, a woman whose face was etched with the weary lines of 30 years of service to the temperamental Colonel, was more than happy to talk. She spoke of the Colonel's increasingly erratic behavior, his obsession with security, and the peculiar way he had been treating his nephew, Arthur. "He was a hard man, Miss Marple," Mrs. Emmett whispered, glancing toward the door as if the Colonel's ghost might march in and demand his boots be polished. "Lately he was convinced someone was stealing from his private safe. Not money, mind you, papers. He spent hours in that sunken garden, sitting on the bench by the sundial, just staring at the wall. He said it was the only place he felt truly alone. And poor Mr. Arthur, the Colonel had threatened to cut him out of the will entirely if he didn't marry that Vance woman. He wanted the Vance money to shore up the estate, you see." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes tracking a small, persistent spider weaving a web in the corner of the window frame. "It is a very heavy thing being a captive to an inheritance. It reminds me of young Peter West in my youth. His father wouldn't let him join the Navy until he'd spent 5 years in the family flour mill. Peter didn't argue, he just waited. People think silence is agreement, but often it is just a different kind of preparation. But tell me, Mrs. Emmett, did the Colonel have any visitors lately? Someone from outside the village, perhaps?" "Only a man from the insurance company," the housekeeper replied. "A very sharp-looking fellow. He spent a long time looking at the gate. He said the Colonel wanted to make sure the lock was absolute. It was a new lock, you know, installed only last month. The Colonel had only 2 keys, one in his pocket and one kept in the study drawer." Leaving the kitchen, Miss Marple wandered toward the sunken garden, where Inspector Slack was currently examining the gate with a magnifying glass. He looked up, his face reddening with irritation. "Now then, Miss Marple, this isn't a place for a morning stroll. This is a crime scene, though what kind of crime it is, I'm still trying to figure out. The doctor says it was a heart attack, but a man doesn't just have a heart attack because he's standing in a garden. Unless, perhaps, he was startled, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Or unless he saw something that shouldn't have been there. It is a very sturdy gate, isn't it? Such a lovely design. It reminds me of the birdcage my Aunt Fanny used to keep. The door was always locked, yet the canary somehow managed to get its feathers caught in the bars every Tuesday. We couldn't understand it until we realized Aunt Fanny was feeding it through the scrollwork with a very long pair of tweezers. It was the only way she could reach the poor thing without opening the door and letting the cat in." Slack stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Tweezers? What on earth have tweezers got to do with a dead Colonel?" "Oh, probably nothing at all," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I was just thinking about the red thread I noticed yesterday. Red is such a difficult color to hide against grey stone, don't you think? It's like a beacon." If one were looking for a trail, a red thread is a very good place to start, especially if that thread was once part of something much longer. As she walked away, Miss Marple noted that Arthur Melford was watching them from the library window. He looked pale and hollowed out, but there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was not mourning so much as waiting for a signal. The early investigation was focused on how someone could have gotten in, but Miss Marple was already considering the possibility that the murderer had never needed to enter the garden at all. In St. Mary Mead, the most successful traps were always the ones where the victim walked into the cage and turned the key themselves, never realizing that the bars had been prepared long before they arrived. Inspector Slack's frustration had finally found a target, and that target was Arthur Melford. To a man of Slack's temperament, a lack of physical evidence was merely an invitation to lean more heavily on motive. By the following afternoon, the inspector had unearthed a series of increasingly frantic telegrams from a London bookmaker addressed to the young nephew. It appeared that Arthur's interest in the local horse races had been far more than a casual hobby. He was, in fact, drowning in a sea of gambling debts that the Colonel's modest allowance could never hope to settle. The motive was as old as time: a desperate young man, a wealthy, tyrannical uncle, and a legacy that promised a clean slate. It's an open and shut case, even if the door was locked, Slack declared to the room at large, his voice booming through the library of Wisteria Lodge. Melford knew the Colonel would never pay those debts. He knew he was about to be disinherited. He had the opportunity to tamper with the Colonel's heart medication, or perhaps he just gave the old man a shock he couldn't survive. And as for the gate, he was the first one to reach it. He could have slipped that key through the bars easily enough in the confusion. Miss Marple, who had been invited to stay for a cup of tea by the increasingly distressed Mrs. Emmett, sat in a velvet armchair near the fireplace. Her knitting needles continued their rhythmic click-clack, a sound as steady as a heartbeat. "It is a very compelling theory, Inspector," she said softly. "It reminds me so much of young Harold Peake. He was always in trouble with the village shopkeepers, and when his grandmother's silver tea service went missing, everyone assumed he had pawned it to cover his tailor's bills. It turned out, however, that the grandmother had hidden it herself in the flour bin because she was afraid of the new maid. We often mistake a man's misfortunes for his crimes, don't we? Arthur is certainly a very foolish young man, but foolishness and murder are two very different branches on the same tree." Slack snorted. "He has no alibi for the 10 minutes before the garden tour, Miss Marple. He says he was in the washroom, but no one saw him. And he was the one who insisted on checking the gate first. Why so eager, if not to plant the key? Perhaps he was eager because he was terrified," Miss Marple mused. "But tell me, Inspector, did you happen to look at Arthur's shoes?" "I noticed them as he was shaking the gate. They were perfectly polished, yet there was a small smudge of green on the left heel. It wasn't grass, it was too bright. It looked remarkably like the paint used on the garden benches. But those benches were painted 3 months ago and are perfectly dry, except, of course, for the one in the sunken garden, which the gardener touched up just last week." Slack frowned, his brow furrowing. "The gardener? What has a smudge of paint to do with anything? If he has paint on his shoes, it just proves he was in the garden." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "But the gate was locked. If Arthur was outside the gate with the rest of us, how did he get paint from a bench that is 10 yards inside the enclosure? He couldn't have climbed the wall. His suit is immaculate, and he couldn't have slipped the bars. It suggests that Arthur was in that garden before the Colonel ever reached for his key. But if he was inside, and the Colonel locked the gate from the outside, then Arthur would have been trapped. And yet, there he was, standing on the gravel path with the rest of us when the Colonel fell." Arthur Melford, who had been hovering near the doorway, suddenly turned and fled toward the back of the house. Slack made to follow him, but Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. "I don't think he's running from you, Inspector. I think he's running from the memory of what he saw. He has a secret, certainly, but I suspect it is the secret of a man who tried to be a thief and found himself a witness to something much worse. It's like the time the choir boy tried to steal the communion wine and ended up seeing the vicar's wife putting a live frog in the collection plate. He couldn't tell the truth without admitting his own sin, so he just stayed silent and looked guilty. Miss Marple looked back at her knitting, her mind revolving around that smudge of bright green paint. It was a discrepancy that didn't fit the inspector's neat narrative. If Arthur had been inside the garden and then outside it without using the gate, then the impossible nature of the locked garden was a lie. But the walls were impassable. She thought of the red silk thread again, and the way it had been caught at the very top of the ironwork. It wasn't a smudge of paint or a gambling debt that occupied her thoughts now, but the mechanics of a transition that should have been impossible. The pattern was there, shimmering just beneath the surface of the village's outrage, waiting for a single small detail to pull it all together. The heavy summer heat of St. Mary Mead seemed to concentrate within the high stone walls of the sunken rose garden, turning the air into a stagnant pool of floral scent and unanswered questions. Inspector Slack had moved his investigation to the vicarage for the afternoon, leaving the grounds of Wisteria Lodge in a state of uneasy quiet. Miss Marple, however, had not joined the exodus. She had returned to the scene of the tragedy, moving with a deliberate, slow pace that the guards interpreted as the aimless wandering of an elderly lady. She did not look at the gate, nor did she look at the dark patch of grass where the colonel had fallen. Instead, her attention was fixed upon the base of the ornamental sundial that stood at the very center of the enclosure. The sundial was a weathered piece of stone, its brass gnomon casting a sharp shadow that pointed toward the late afternoon hours. Miss Marple knelt with surprising agility for a woman of her years, her fingers brushing against the mossy base. She wasn't looking for a weapon or a footprint. She was looking for something much smaller. After a few moments of scrutiny, she found it. Wedged deep into a crevice where the stone base met the turf was a tiny circular piece of metal, no larger than a shirt button. It was a brass washer, polished and clean, showing none of the weathering that had aged the sundial itself. She picked it up with a gloved hand, turning it over to catch the light. It was a common enough item, the sort of thing one might find in any handyman's toolbox, but its presence here was a glaring anomaly in a garden that was maintained with surgical precision. It reminded her of the time the village blacksmith, Mr. Toke, had insisted his daughter's bicycle had been sabotaged by a rival suitor. Everyone had looked for cut wires or bent spokes, but Miss Marple had noticed a single misplaced nut on the garden path. It was the smallest part of the machine that had failed because it was the part that had been moved to make a larger change possible. A washer, she murmured to herself, her eyes tracking from the sundial toward the high wall and then back to the gate. A very specific kind of tension, I should think. Like the pulleys they used for the stage curtains during the Christmas pantomime. If you have enough leverage and a smooth enough surface, you can move quite heavy things without anyone ever realizing they've been shifted. She stood up and walked toward the far corner of the garden, where the stone wall was obscured by a thick growth of ivy. She reached into the foliage, her hand encountering something hard and cold behind the leaves. It was a small iron ring bolt, recently installed and tucked out of sight. It was perfectly aligned with the sundial and the top of the gate. She thought of the red silk thread she had seen earlier, a thread that was strong, thin, and remarkably slippery. It was the sort of thread used by fishermen or, more importantly, by those who needed to pull a weight across a distance without creating friction. "It is a matter of geometry, Jane," she whispered, as if Dolly Bantry was standing beside her. "People think a locked gate is a barrier, but it can also be a pivot. If you have a long enough line and a way to pull it from the outside, the key doesn't need a hand to turn it. It only needs a certain amount of torque." She sat on the painted garden bench, the one that had left the bright green smudge on Arthur Melford's shoe. She realized now why Arthur had been inside the garden. He hadn't been there to kill his uncle, he had been there to witness the impossibility of the act. He had been a pawn in a much more sophisticated game. The Colonel had been a man of immense routine, and someone had utilized that routine to create a death that looked like an act of God, or at least an act of magic. The hidden clue was not the washer itself, but what the washer represented, a mechanical solution to a human problem. The Colonel had died of a heart attack, the doctor was certain of that, but a heart attack can be induced by a sudden sharp pain, a needle prick perhaps, or a small projectile, that leaves almost no mark but causes the heart to seize in a man of the Colonel's age and temperament. Miss Marple thought of Julian Thorne's pocket watch and the precision of his movements. A solicitor is a man of detail, a man who knows that the timing of a signature is just as important as the signature itself. She stood up, her knitting bag tucked firmly under her arm. The village was looking for a ghost who could pass through walls, but Miss Marple was looking for a technician who understood the mathematics of murder. The pattern was nearly complete. All that remained was to discover who had the most to gain from a death that appeared to have no human cause. As she walked toward the gate, she paused to look at the lock one last time. It wasn't just a lock, it was the final piece of a very clever, very deadly machine. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself in the quiet, dust-moted atmosphere of Julian Thorne's legal chambers. The solicitor was a man who surrounded himself with the heavy, leather-bound reassurances of the law, but today the air in the room felt remarkably thin. He sat behind a desk cluttered with the Colonel's estate papers, his expression one of weary professionalism that did not quite reach his watchful eyes. He had been explaining the complexities of the Gore will, emphasizing that while Arthur Melford was the primary heir, the estate was so heavily encumbered by debt that the boy would inherit little more than a title and a crumbling roof. It was a bleak picture, painted with the practiced strokes of a man who dealt in the dissolution of dreams. "It is all very distressing, Miss Marple," Thorne said, leaning back and tapping his silver fountain pen against his blotter. The Colonel was a man of great pride but very little liquidity. He had invested heavily in a series of overseas ventures that have recently collapsed. To put it bluntly, he died just in time to avoid a very public bankruptcy. Had he lived another month, Wisteria Lodge would likely have been seized by the creditors. It is a mercy in a way that he was spared the humiliation. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to unsettle the solicitor. "A mercy indeed, Mr. Thorne. It reminds me so much of the old draper in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Simmons. He was a man of immense standing, yet when he passed we discovered his ledgers were more fiction than fact. He had been borrowing from the future to pay for the past. It turned out his silent partner was the one who had the most to lose. A very respectable lady who had invested her entire dowry in his silk trade. When the trade failed, she didn't just lose her money, she lost her chance at a quiet retirement. People do very desperate things when their security is threatened by another person's incompetence." Thorne's pen stopped tapping. "A silent partner. I'm not sure I see the relevance here. Oh, I was merely thinking of Mrs. Diana Vance," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes bright and innocent behind her spectacles. "The village gossip says she and the Colonel were close, but I noticed the way she looked at you during the garden tour. It wasn't the look of a casual acquaintance. It was the look of someone who shared a very heavy secret. It occurred to me that perhaps she wasn't just a friend of the Colonel, but a creditor, and perhaps you, as the Colonel's man of business, were the only one who knew that her fortune had disappeared into the same overseas hole as his." The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Thorne did not blink, but a small muscle in his jaw twitched. Miss Marple continued, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "If the Colonel were to go bankrupt while alive, Mrs. Vance would get nothing. But if he were to die while the estate was still technically solvent, the insurance policies would pay out, and the creditors, including a silent partner, might be made whole. It is a very strong motive for a woman of Mrs. Vance's temperament, and perhaps for a solicitor who felt responsible for the advice he had given her. "You are suggesting a conspiracy of silence, Miss Marple," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "That is a very serious allegation to make without a shred of proof." "I am merely observing patterns, Mr. Thorne," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirts. "Patterns of behavior are often more reliable than legal documents. I saw Mrs. Vance in the village earlier, wearing a very beautiful red silk scarf. It was a lovely shade, almost exactly the color of the thread I found snagged on the garden gate, and I couldn't help but notice that her scarf was missing a small tassel from the fringe. It is a very small thing, of course, but small things are the rivets that hold a large deception together, like the brass washer I found near the sundial. It didn't belong to the sundial, but it certainly belonged to a mechanism. Perhaps a mechanism designed to turn a key from 20 yards away. Leaving the office, Miss Marple felt the weight of the solicitor's gaze on her back. She knew now that the secrets of Wisteria Lodge were not buried in the will, but in the frantic desperation of two people who had seen their futures vanishing. Diana Vance had the motive, and Julian Thorne had the technical mind to construct the miracle of the locked gate. The confrontation had confirmed the link between them, a bond of mutual survival that had been forged in the shadows of the Colonel's failing empire. The pattern was now visible in its entirety, a cold and calculated tragedy of financial ruin and mechanical ingenuity. All that remained was to prove that the red thread of Diana Vance's desperation had been the very thing that turned the lock on the Colonel's life. The stillness of the afternoon at Wisteria Lodge was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic heavy thud of a sledgehammer. Inspector Slack, driven to a state of near-maniacal determination by Miss Marple's cryptic hints about bird cages and tweezers, had decided to inspect the one part of the sunken rose garden that had remained undisturbed, the ornamental sundial itself. His theory, though crude, was that the stone pillar might house a mechanical device or a hidden compartment used to hide the murderer. However, as the stone base was pried away from the earth, the revelation was far more mundane and yet infinitely more shocking. Tucked into the hollow beneath the plinth was a small, waterproof metal box containing a stack of letters and a second, identical brass key to the garden gate. This discovery immediately threw the timeline of the crime into total disarray. If a second key existed and was hidden within the garden itself, it suggested that someone had been entering and exiting the locked enclosure long before the day of the bazaar. Even more baffling was the content of the letters. They were not from a blackmailer or a business rival, but from the Colonel's own brother, a man long thought to have died in the colonies 20 years ago. The correspondence suggested that the brother was alive, living in a small cottage on the edge of the village, and had been meeting the Colonel in secret within the privacy of the sunken garden. Miss Marple sat on the terrace, watching the commotion with a look of profound, quiet sorrow. Beside her, Dolly Bantry was practically vibrating with the news. "A secret brother, Jane! Can you imagine? Living right under our noses in Marsh End Cottage. They say the Colonel has been paying him for years to keep him off the property. If the brother is the heir, then Arthur Melford gets nothing at all. It changes everything. The police think the brother must have been hiding in the garden all along, waiting for his chance." "It is a very dramatic twist, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking with a renewed sharp intensity. "But a secret brother is like a second coat of paint. It covers the original color, but it doesn't change the shape of the wood underneath. We must ask ourselves why the Colonel would hide the key under the sundial. He was a man of immense distrust. If he were meeting his brother, he would want to be the one to let him in and out. He wouldn't leave a key lying about for someone else to find." "No, the Colonel didn't put that key there. It was put there by someone who wanted it to be found after the death. It is a secondary deception designed to lead the police toward a ghost. But the letters, Jane, they're in the Colonel's handwriting. Handwriting can be mirrored by a patient hand, Miss Marple mused, her gaze fixed on the high wall. It reminds me of the time the local schoolmaster's wife tried to claim she had a long-lost twin to explain why she was seen at the races in Brighton. It was a very clever story, and she even had the letters to prove it. But she made one fatal mistake. The twins' letters used the same peculiar spelling of sincerely that the schoolmaster's wife always used. People can change their names, but they rarely change their orthography. I noticed that the letters in that box use the same legal phrasing I saw in Mr. Thorne's office yesterday. Aforementioned, herein estoppel, not the words of a soldier, but the words of a solicitor. The twist had indeed shifted the focus, but for Miss Marple it only served to highlight the true killer's deception. The secret brother was a phantom, a red herring manufactured from old family history to provide a convenient, untraceable suspect. The second key had been planted to explain how a murderer could have been inside a locked garden, thereby protecting the person who had actually stayed outside. By creating a second impossible suspect, the real killer was making the first impossible crime seem like part of a larger, more mysterious conspiracy. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Slack raced off toward Marsh End Cottage, his face flushed with the thrill of the hunt. She knew he would find the cottage empty, or perhaps occupied by a confused tenant who had no idea who the Colonel was. The murderer was playing for time, hoping that by the time the police realized the brother was a fiction, the estate would be settled and the tracks would be cold. She thought of the red silk thread again. It wasn't just a marker of a path, it was a lifeline for a plan that was beginning to fray at the edges. The pattern was now one of double-layered deceit, but beneath the second key and the forged letters, the mechanical truth of the washer and the silk thread remained as solid as the stone wall itself. The afternoon shadows had begun to stretch across the lawn of Wisteria Lodge when Miss Marple decided to play her final delicate card. She had sent a polite note to Julian Thorne, requesting a brief meeting in the sunken rose garden to discuss a startling discovery she had made regarding the Colonel's long-lost brother. When the solicitor arrived, he found the elderly lady sitting on the very bench that had left the green paint on Arthur's shoe. She looked frail and slightly confused, her knitting needles moving with a hesitant, fluttering motion. Beside her on the bench sat a small, battered leather ledger, one she had borrowed from her own attic, but which, in this light, looked remarkably like a private accounting book. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice wavering just enough to suggest a loss of nerve. "The inspector has gone to the cottage, but I felt I must speak to you first. You see, I found this ledger in the potting shed. It seems the Colonel's brother wasn't just receiving money, he was keeping a record of every penny. And there is a mention here of a Mr. J who was facilitating the transfers. I'm so worried for poor Arthur. If this Mr. J is who I think it is, the police will be quite ruthless, won't they? A solicitor's reputation is such a fragile thing." Thorne stood at the iron gate, his hand gripping the bars. He did not enter the garden, perhaps wary of the very enclosure that had become a tomb. His eyes were fixed on the ledger with a predatory intensity. "A ledger? Miss Marple, you really must be careful. If such a document exists, it is legal evidence. You should hand it to me immediately for safekeeping. As the estate's executor, it is my duty to ensure these matters are handled correctly." "Oh, I know," she sighed, fumbling with her knitting bag. "But I'm so clumsy. I've already made such a muddle of things. I tried to test the lock myself earlier, just to see how the poor Colonel could have been trapped. I used a bit of red silk from my sewing kit, just to see if it would slide through the latch, you know. And do you know what happened? It worked perfectly. The key turned as if by magic when I pulled from the other side. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That someone could kill from a distance and leave the key behind as a calling card." Thorne's face went very still. The mask of professional boredom he usually wore was beginning to crack, revealing a sharp, jagged edge of panic. Silk? Magic? You're talking nonsense, Jane. You've been reading too many sensational novels. There is no Mr. J, and there is no magic. There is only a dead man and a locked gate. Now give me that book. I will, she said, standing up with a sudden, surprising steadiness. But I must tell you the most curious thing. I noticed that when I pulled the silk thread, it left a tiny mark on the brass washer I'd placed behind the lock. Just a microscopic scratch. I imagine if the police were to look at the gate's internal mechanism with a proper microscope, they would find the same red dye from a certain silk scarf. It's like a fingerprint, isn't it? A colourful, invisible fingerprint. Thorne took a step toward the gate, his hand reaching through the bars as if to snatch the ledger. You're bluffing. You're an old woman who sees ghosts in every corner. There is no dye and there is no scratch. Then why are you reaching for the ledger so desperately, Julian? She asked softly. And why did your hand go instinctively to your pocket just now, where you're likely keeping the small spring-loaded device you used to give the Colonel that fatal tiny shock? A heart attack is a natural death, but a needle-thin probe delivered through a gap in the stone wall is a very human intervention. You timed it perfectly with your pocket watch, didn't you? You waited until he was at the sundial in the perfect line of sight. Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh, but his eyes were darting around the garden, looking for any witnesses to this quiet, deadly conversation. He didn't realize that Inspector Slack was standing just inside the French windows of the house, watching the solicitor's every move. Miss Marple had set the stage, and Thorne, driven by the arrogance of his own cleverness, had walked straight into the spotlight. He was no longer the calm man of law. He was a technician who had been caught with his tools exposed. The final test had provided the critical reaction, not a denial of the facts, but a desperate physical attempt to suppress the evidence of his own ingenuity. The following morning, the sunken rose garden was no longer a place of mystery, but a stage for a final, devastating lecture on the mechanics of human desperation. Inspector Slack stood by the gate, looking uncharacteristically silent as Miss Marple stood before the assembled group, including a pale Diana Vance and a handcuffed Julian Thorne. The air was still, and the scent of roses seemed almost suffocating as Miss Marple began to unravel the miracle of the locked gate. She did not speak with triumph, but with the weary tone of someone who had seen the same play performed in 100 different village halls. "It was never a ghost, Inspector," she began, her knitting needles tucked into her bag. "It was a matter of very clever geometry and a very desperate need for money. Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Vance were bound together by a financial ruin that only the Colonel's death could solve. But for the insurance to pay out and the estate to remain solvent, the death had to be natural, and the murderer had to be demonstrably absent. The locked gate was not a barrier to the crime, it was the crime's primary defense. It was designed to tell you that no one could have been near the Colonel when his heart failed." Slack cleared his throat, glancing at the heavy iron bars. "But the doctors said it was a heart attack, Miss Marple, and the key was inside. Thorne was standing 10 yards away with the rest of us." "How do you get past the physical facts?" "By looking at the things that don't belong, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "A heart attack can be a natural event, or it can be a prompted one. Mr. Thorne is a precision man. He used a small, pressurized air gun, a device often used by collectors to move delicate objects, to fire a tiny ice-thin needle through the gap in the stone wall. It struck the Colonel just as he reached the sundial, causing a shock that his weakened heart could not survive. The needle, being made of a rapidly dissolving saline solution, left no trace for the pathologist. But that was only half the trick. The real genius lay in the gate. She pointed to the lock, where a faint shimmer of red silk was still visible to those who knew where to look. Mr. Thorne had prepared the gate days in advance. He had replaced the internal washer with a polished brass one that offered no resistance. He then looped a long, incredibly strong thread of red silk, taken from Mrs. Vance's scarf, through the internal mechanism of the lock and back out through the scrollwork, leading all the way to the ivy-covered wall. When the Colonel entered and the gate clicked shut, he didn't realize that the key was already being manipulated from the outside. As we all stood watching, Julian Thorne used the tension of that silk thread, pulled through a series of hidden ring bolts, to turn the key in the lock from a distance. Once the key had turned, a sharp tug snapped the thread at its weakest point, the snag I found on the finial, and the evidence was simply reeled back into the shadows. Diana Vance let out a low, broken sob, but Thorne remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. Miss Marple looked at him with a sad, steady gaze. The second key in the letters about the brother were your insurance policy, Mr. Thorne. You realized that if the miracle was too perfect, the police might look too closely at the mechanics. You created a phantom suspect to give the inspector a trail to follow, one that led away from the red silk and the brass washer. It was a secondary deception, a way of burying the truth under a layer of family scandal. It reminds me of the old conjurer who used to visit the village. He always made a great show of his left hand so that you wouldn't notice what his right hand was doing. You were the conjurer, Julian, but you forgot that even the best silk leaves a mark when it's pulled against the grain. The revelation of the ice needle and the silk thread pulley system transformed the impossible crime into a cold, clinical execution. The locked garden had not been a sanctuary, but a carefully calibrated trap where the victim's own habits were used against him. Miss Marple explained how the green paint on Arthur's shoe had come from his own attempt to climb the wall earlier that morning to steal the very ledger Thorne had later tried to suppress. Arthur had been a witness to the preparations, but his own guilt had kept him silent until Miss Marple provided the bridge for the truth. The pattern was complete, a tragedy of greed and ingenuity that had been unravelled not by forensic science, but by the observation of a red thread and a misplaced brass washer. The following weeks in St. Mary Mead were characterized by a quiet, brooding stillness, as if the village itself were trying to digest a meal that had proven far too rich for its constitution. The departure of Julian Thorne in a discreet police vehicle had been witnessed by many from behind their lace curtains, yet described by few in the days that followed. Wisteria Lodge stood empty now, the locked garden gate having been permanently secured with a heavy, rusted chain that lacked the mechanical elegance of its predecessor. The Midsummer Harvest Bazaar was remembered no longer for its prize-winning squashes or the vicar's speech, but as the day the laws of physics and the laws of the land had briefly, violently diverged. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows across her flower beds. She was working on a new pair of mittens, the needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the distant, drowsy hum of the village. Beside her, Dolly Bantry was attempting to navigate the complexities of a crossword puzzle, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. The news from the London solicitors had finally arrived. The secret brother had indeed been a fiction, a masterful forgery of family history created by Thorne to safeguard his own interests. Arthur Melford had been cleared of all suspicion, though he had quietly slipped away to the coast, perhaps seeking a horizon that didn't involve high stone walls or the heavy weight of an uncle's expectations. "It is a very strange feeling, Jane," Dolly sighed, setting down her pen. "To think that we were all standing right there, watching a man be murdered by a piece of silk and a pocket watch. It makes the world feel quiet, untrustworthy. One expects a villain to be a monster, not a man who handles one's conveyancing so efficiently. I shall never look at a silk scarf the same way again without checking for pulleys." Miss Marple smiled gently, pausing to adjust a stitch. "It is a common mistake, Dolly, to think that evil must wear a frightening mask. In my experience, the most dangerous people are often the ones who are the most orderly, They believe that because they can control the mechanics of a machine or the wording of a contract, they can control the consequences of their own actions. Julian Thorne was a man of immense talent, but he lacked the one thing that truly keeps a person safe, a respect for the unpredictability of the human heart. He saw the Colonel as a problem to be solved with geometry, and he saw us as a crowd to be fooled with a trick. He forgot that even the smallest thread can leave a trail if the wind is blowing in the right direction. The village had, in its typical fashion, found a way to move on, while keeping the scandal alive in whispers. Mrs. Vance had moved away to stay with relatives in the north, her reputation as a silent partner having made her presence in St. Mary Mead untenable. The sunken rose garden was beginning to look a little neglected, the weeds creeping over the edges of the paths where the Colonel had once walked with such rigid purpose. Nature, it seemed, had no interest in maintaining the perimeters of a man who had tried to lock out the world. "I suppose it's all for the best," Dolly mused. "But I do wonder, Jane, how you knew. It wasn't just the thread, was it? You looked at that gate as if you already knew it was a lie before you even saw the lock." "I think, dear, it was because I have seen so many people try to build perfect lives," Miss Marple replied, her eyes distant and thoughtful. "It reminds me of the old clockmaker back in my childhood. He spent 10 years building a clock that would never lose a second. It was a marvel of brass and silver, but the day he finished it, he realized he had forgotten to leave a way to wind it. He had been so focused on perfecting movement that he forgot the necessity of the human hand. Julian Thorne's offense was like clockwork. It was technically perfect, but it was spiritually hollow. A locked door always invites a question, Dolly, and once you start asking questions, the answer is usually much closer than you think. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the hollyhocks, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of peace return to her garden. The mystery was solved, the pattern was complete, and the village of St. Mary Mead was settling back into its comfortable, predictable routines. She picked up her knitting basket and stood, her knees creaking slightly in the evening chill. The world was full of people who thought they could turn the keys of fate at bay, but Miss Marple knew better. She knew that the only truly locked rooms were the ones we created within ourselves, and that eventually every gate must swing open to the light.